So, is God anti-science? This message really should be titled, Is Science Anti-God? Because a lot of people have the question, does science disprove faith? Has the rise of modern science shown that faith is irrational? That's really what I want to get into in this message. It's a very important subject. I want to start with a quote from the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. Lewis writes, "Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there." Now, a quick heads up, Lewis writes, since men have been able to think. Why does he say just men? Because women have always been able to think. He actually wrote this material like 70 years ago, and in some spots the language and concepts can be a bit dated. And I mention that so that you don't let it get in the way of his basic argument of faith, which I think is brilliant. He goes on to write, and very roughly, two views have been held. First, there is what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed, and nobody knows why. And that the matter behaving in certain fixed ways has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. So that's one view, the materialist view. Just a random event, it can't be explained, just kind of this giant machine. The other view is the religious view. According to it, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it's like anything else we know. That is to say, it's conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And then, to paraphrase, Lewis also writes, "Don't think that one of these views is old and one is new. They've been around as long as people can think." Now, in our day, many thoughtful people wonder, has science disproved or proven correct what Lewis calls the materialist view? That the universe is a machine, that God does not exist, that faith is irrational. Now, I want to look at that in this message, considering a number of key questions. One caveat, I'm not a scientist. I know I'm not a scientist. I know in a crowd like this, a lot of you have forgotten way more about many branches of science than I will ever know. So I'm just going to ask that you extend me some grace. Okay, so first question. Is science the only way to legitimately know something? Science has great prestige in our day, so this is a very important question. And there are other kinds, are there other kinds of knowledge besides scientific knowledge? Now, the short answer is yes. There are other kinds of knowledge. And if we don't recognize that, it really limits what we will know in order to be able to live. Maybe many of you remember in school learning about something called the scientific method. Actually, it's a little tricky to define precisely, but it has to do with the notion that we make observations, and they lead to theories, and then there will be a hypothesis designed to test the theory, and then we run an experiment, and we're able to measure stuff, and the outcome will either confirm or fail to confirm the hypothesis. And because science has been pretty amazing, actually there's been amazing progress in fields like medicine and technology, some people claim this scientific method or empirical verification is the only way to reliable knowledge. That would mean, by the way, that there is no such thing as moral knowledge or spiritual knowledge or personal knowledge. This view that the only knowledge that counts comes from the scientific method is sometimes called scientism. Not science, but scientism. There's a guy named Sir John Polkinghorne. He's a Cambridge physicist and an Anglican priest. And he may be the greatest thinker about faith and science issues in our day. He has a very helpful illustration. He says, imagine someone asks, why is the water boiling in that kettle? And one person answers, because burning gas is heating the water. Another person answers, because I want a cup of tea. Which answer is correct? Well, they're both correct. One person is talking about non-personal causes, mechanical forces, and that's what science tends to do. The other answer talks in terms of a person and purpose and intention. It's not scientific in a mechanistic way, but it's true and it's terribly important. You see, science involves a method that is enormously useful to investigate large chunks of reality, but it's not the only way to know truth. Human life is of great value. That's true. And you know that. But you can't put that in a test tube. It's wrong to live for selfish greed. That's true. I mean, that's just moral truth. A society that is unable to recognize the existence of moral truth is headed for serious trouble. Scientism is a dogma that says any dimension that cannot be exhaustively explained by the scientific method doesn't exist or doesn't matter. By the way, scientism itself, as an ideology which is rampant in our day, could never be proven or established by the scientific method. So is science the only way to legitimately know something? No, it's not. It's very important, but it's not the only way. The second question, has science proven the universe is just a random machine with no purpose? Again, this is a very important issue for us to think about if we're going to be people of faith or if we're going to consider faith. This idea also is quite rampant in our day. I'll give you one quote about this. This is from William Provine, who taught at Cornell University in the field of science. Consider the claims that he made about this statement. He said, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loud and clear. This is a claim that the field of evolutionary biology has established. There are no gods, no purposes, and no goal-directed forces of any kind. There is no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead. There is no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning in life, and no free will for humans either." Now, just as a matter of scientific inquiry, if we were to ask, where is a single article in a single peer-reviewed journal confirmed by a single double-blind study that establishes or even addresses a single one of these mammoth claims? There is nothing in all the literature of evolutionary biology that is even in the neighborhood. Those are not the kinds of claims that get studied or written about in those kinds of journals. None of those questions fall into that discipline or are investigated by those methods. Yet there's this idea out there in the ether somewhere that this has just been found out in order to discredit faith. Here's another quote. This is from an astronomer named Carl Sagan, and faith was something to which he did not ascribe. He said, "We find that we live on an insignificant planet of a humdrum star lost in a galaxy tucked away in some forgotten corner of a universe in which there are far more galaxies than people." Now, notice the loaded words and language that he uses. Insignificant, humdrum, lost, tucked away, forgotten. Those are not scientific terms, but they're weighted with meaning. And the idea of statements like this is that somehow science, by showing us how immense the size and the age of the universe is, has shown us that tiny little human beings do not have unique dignity or value or worth in ways that faith has taught us. Again, this kind of thing tends to get spread in our day. However, the idea that there's a contrast between the immensity of nature and the tininess and brevity of human life, we didn't invent that idea. We didn't discover that contrast. People have been thinking about that for a long time. The psalmist said thousands of years ago, "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them." You see, precisely the same contrast was the object of real serious reflection a long time ago. And we get so arrogant about ourselves. The psalmist does not go on to say, the way to settle this one is to look at the scale of stuff in terms of physical size. I think people are huge. I think the earth is huge. And the sun and the moon and the stars are tiny. And so we win. The psalmist doesn't say that. The psalmist says, "You've made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet." We're told in Genesis that we were made in the image of God. Human beings are invested with a divinity, a divine image. They have this capacity to learn and create. They have the weight that comes with being a moral agent being able to make decisions and being responsible for those decisions, being able to care for creation. It's staggering. That's why we respond to people the way we respond to them when we see them. Does anyone here have grandchildren? Or are there any grandparents in the room? Would you raise your hands really high like you're proud of it? All right. How many of you, your grandchildren are smarter and better looking than any other grandchildren that you ever know? Yeah. So why do we have those kinds of feelings? Because when we look at little human beings, we know that it's not just a blob of tissue. It's not just a collection of jiggling atoms. We know this. If significance were measured by size, whales would be the most important creature on the planet. And no one's arguing that. Any worldview or system of thought that cannot account for the inescapable weight, dignity, and value of human beings must simply be found wanting by any sane, rational evaluation. And you have to decide what you think about that. I just think that's inescapable. Any worldview, any system of thought that cannot account for the inescapable weight, dignity, and value of a human being must simply be found wanting by any sane, rational evaluation. All right, question number 3. What does the apparently indistinguishable human desire for purpose tell us about human existence? Because it's there. And I'll give you another quote. This is from a guy named Curtis White. Curtis White is not a believer, but he's written a fascinating book called The Science Delusion. He critiques this whole notion of scientism, that the scientific method can tell us everything there is to know about existence. And part of what happens when scientism is you end up not only with this universe that is where there is no God, you end up in this universe where there is no personhood. Well, Curtis White, in his book, quotes Jim Watson. Jim Watson won the Nobel Prize for his work on the DNA double helix. Watson asked one time, what are human beings for? What is their purpose? His argument is they have no purpose. Watson says, well, I don't think we are anything. We're just products of evolution. So we're just products, nothing more. And you can say, gee, your life must be pretty bleak if you don't think there's a purpose, but I'm having a good lunch. Watson's idea is there is no purpose, but I can get along just fine without any sense of purpose. And then he asks, but can I? Can anybody? Can Jim Watson? And White goes on to point out that while Jim Watson claimed that human life is nothing more than jiggling atoms, he didn't seem to think that his accomplishments were nothing more than jiggling atoms. The story of how he fought and struggled and did a bunch of stuff to get the recognition of a Nobel Prize is actually quite interesting as White spells it out. It's as if Jim Watson were saying, the earth is insignificant, people are transient, existence is random, life is meaningless, but I won the Nobel Prize. Hey, look, Ma, I made it. The universe evokes a sense of wonder in us that is remarkably stubborn. We were having a family night recently, and I got to pick the movies, and so I picked this Planet Earth type movie, and I saw something that I had never seen before. These dolphins have figured out how to swim in a circle and flap their tail fin to kind of stir up mud as they hunt for fish, and I'm not going to try to explain it to you, just check this out.
These are bottlenose dolphins, one of the most intelligent animals on Earth. Their prey is very elusive, fast-swimming fish. But the dolphins have invented a completely new way of hunting. By beating its tail down hard, this dolphin stirs up the shallow silt. And by swimming in a tight circle, it creates a ring of mushrooming mud around a shoal of fish. The contracting ring traps the fish just like a net. Panicked, the fish jump to escape, right into the open mouths of the waiting dolphins. Again and again, the lead dolphin creates a circle before they all line up with perfect timing.
Isn't that wonderful? Wonder is this indistinguishable realization, not just that something is, but that it's good. It's the human heart echoing those words back in Genesis. God spoke, and it was so, and God saw that it was good. You know, wonder moves us dangerously close to worship. If you're thoughtful, you have to ask, is our hunger for wonder and meaning a clue to something just beyond material reality? And C.S. Lewis writes that he thinks it is in a very provocative passage. He writes, creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. People feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. It's good, isn't it? All right, question number 4. Haven't science and religion always been at war with each other, offering rival explanations on the way things are? So this warfare view is a very common one. And here's a classic example of this. In about 1633, the Catholic Church found the scientist Galileo guilty of heresy because he wrote and taught that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around. That actually happened. And things like this actually can happen still. People of faith, Christians, can and do get into trouble when they assume too quickly that they understand the way the Bible should be interpreted around an issue where God actually wants human beings to do scientific investigation. See, we have these statements in the Bible. The earth is firmly established on its foundation. It cannot be moved. And there were people who figured, well, that means we don't have to try to examine it scientifically because there it is in the Bible. But they were not interpreting the Bible correctly. Christians and thoughtful people in general should be cautious about assuming too quickly that we can infer scientific knowledge based on biblical statements. However, the notion that science and religion historically has been at war with each other is actually a myth. And as a matter of fact, historically, again, in our day, people do not tend to know this kind of thing. Science emerged primarily from people of faith. A guy by the name of Rodney Stark at Baylor University did a study on this. In 17th century Europe, kind of the cradle of science in many ways, out of the 52 leading scientists, he did a study on their beliefs. 62% of them were what he called devout believers. 34% of them were conventionally religious, and only 2 out of 52 were religious skeptics. Of course, by that time in the 17th century Europe, there were a fair number of skeptics, but only 2 of the leading 52 scientists were among them. Not only were science and faith not enemies, there are a bunch of people who work in the history of science. Again, you could read about this. One of them is named Paul Chamberlain. He puts it like this: the scientific experience, or the scientific enterprise as we know it, would probably not exist had it not been for Christianity. Again, this is widely not known or thought about in our day at a popular level. It runs counter to a lot of current understanding. A scientist by the name of John Houghton, he points out that there's this false idea in our day that belief in God actually got started out because of our inability to understand things scientifically. There's this false belief that that's kind of where faith comes from. People didn't know what caused thunder, and so they made up Thor. People didn't know what governed the moon, and so they made up the goddess Diana. Faith in God is not based on gaps that science haven't filled in yet. People who are non-believers sometimes think it is. Sadly, believers sometimes think, if we can find an area where science hasn't explained it yet, then we can say that God did it, and then that's evidence for faith. You see, the God of the gaps, this whole idea is a bad foundation to build your faith on, because every time that gap gets filled in, your faith gets shaky. Faith in God is based on observations of meaning, value, and order that actually underlie the rise of science itself. The rise of science happened at a particular point, in a particular history, in a particular civilization. It didn't exist in the ancient world as we know it. Historically, the rise of science required a worldview that involves the notion that our world is orderly and will reward rational investigation. In the ancient world, they thought the earth was involved in this endless cycle of existence. Things go up and down, get better or worse, in this constant tug of war between the gods or whatever kind of forces, and then chaos. The notion that the world is orderly and will reward rational investigation came from a worldview that began with faith in an all-powerful rational God. A prize-winning biochemist named Melvin Calvin, Nobel winner, he said, "This monotheistic view seems to be the historical foundation for modern science." Of course, there are many other ingredients required for science to emerge, but a certain kind of worldview that the world is orderly and will repay orderly investigation was part of what was needed for science to arise. Alfred North Whitehead, one of the dominant thinkers of the 20th century, when he was asked for the causes of the rise of science, said it was the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. All right, question number 5. Hasn't evolution disproved Genesis? This has become a huge hot button topic. Evolution is a very controversial thing. A little boy goes to his dad and asks, "Dad, where did human beings come from?" His father says, "Well, we descended from the apes." The boy goes to his mom, "Mom, where did human beings come from?" She says, "We were created by God in God's image." The boy says, "But Dad said we descended from apes." The mom says, "Well, I was talking about my side of the family." I'll say a word first about Genesis and then about evolution. John Walton, he wrote a great book on Genesis, on the Genesis creation account called The Lost World of Genesis 1. If you want to read a book on this, I highly recommend it. John Walton, The Lost World of Genesis 1. He notes that in studying the Bible, you always have to begin by asking how it would be understood by the audience reading it in that day when it was written. You have to start by asking about the historical context of the intended audience, because the Bible always emerges out of a conversation of that day. For us as a church, to be wise readers, to be wise students of the Bible, we really have to be grounded in this. In our day, even in the church, very often people get off track with the Bible, especially at the very beginning in Genesis and the very end in Revelation. People get into all kinds of goofy ideas about them if they assume I don't have to begin by looking at the historical context and asking what the initial readers would have understood it to mean. I can just read into it whatever I would happen to read into it out of my own time and culture and agenda. There's kind of an arrogance to that. A failure in humility to say, I'll pay attention to the historical context. So Walton spent a lot of time looking into this. There was a conversation, as there always is among human beings, in the ancient Mesopotamian world. Where did we come from? How did the earth get here? But it was a very different conversation than the agenda of our day. And it's critical that we understand this to understand Genesis. I grew up in the church. I didn't know that there was an ancient conversation going on. I just assumed that the Bible was this magic book and Genesis just got dropped on out of heaven. I was actually kind of threatened to find that there was this rich conversation going on. And of course, the language and concepts of that conversation were part of what God used by the writer of Genesis, because it got written in the context of that discussion. And Walton notes in Genesis 1 and 2 that they're primarily about the one true God. They're not all these little tribal gods like fighting back forces of chaos. In the ancient world, they weren't particularly concerned about how something got here from nothing. They were very concerned with how order triumphed over chaos. That was the big thing their stories were about. So he writes primarily in Genesis about how the one true God, the good God, was inaugurating the cosmos into a functioning temple. That's all the temple imagery in Genesis 1 and 2. That's why. Where we would take up residence and then deploy where he would take up residence and then deploy his image bearers, that's human beings that were created in the image of God, to extend his reign, to exercise dominion, so that all the earth could be ordered and become sacred space where God could dwell with his community. Of course, in our day, different Christians interpret Genesis 1 and 2 differently. And from my part, I believe the best reading of it, just on biblical terms, is that it's not about how, or it's not about how long, or the role of mutation, or natural selection in 21st century terms. Those questions were not around back then. Genesis is addressing questions that were around back then in ways that have laid out the identity of human beings and our place in the cosmos with matchless, world-changing truth. Therefore, it's very legitimate for science to explore all the questions of how and how long. And we just get to sit back and watch and discover, oh, that's how God did it. Oh, that's how God did it. I just want to say a personal word here. I've seen too many young people in too many churches exposed to bad science, to shoddy thinking, false claims, and this misguided idea. Maybe it's well-intended, but misguided, that someone was defending the Bible when they were really defending a wrong interpretation of the Bible. And then I've watched them, real bright young people go off and pursue education, go to college, begin to read, and discover that they were misinformed. And then they think they have to choose between the Bible and truth. Well, you don't. You have to do better than that. I think that's part of what God is calling us to as a church, to be a place of thoughtful faith, where we are humble before truth. On the other hand, I want to say this. Sometimes secularists will misuse the language or theory of evolution to make claims about human identity that are false or destructive. For example, a study found that chimps share 99.4% of DNA with human beings. One researcher said about this, we humans appear as only slightly remodeled chimpanzee-like apes, only slightly remodeled. One guy writing about this actually titled his book, The Third Chimpanzee. There are two species of chimps, and the title was essentially implying, based on the percentage of shared DNA, that human beings are simply a third species of chimp, that there's really not much difference between human beings and chimps. Now, if you really believe that, if you wonder if that's really true, just ask yourself, would you ever have a chimpanzee babysit one of your children? Would you elect one to Congress? You can insert your own joke there. Would you date one? Would you put one on trial for an ethical breach and hold one morally accountable for its behavior? You see, human identity, the human condition, human worth, are huge questions. And they're not going to be answered by an analysis of shared percentages of DNA with other creatures. They're not those kinds of questions. And when they get expressed as if they were, then it's not right, and it's not bright. The biblical idea is, in the wonderful words of Dallas Willard, that you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe. And you have to decide, is that true? Or are you a third chimpanzee? Again, I understand there are real bright people who wrestle and struggle with that, and I don't say that to demean anyone, but those two ideas are going to lead down very different paths. All right, question 6. Doesn't the Big Bang show that the universe didn't need God to create it? I'm sure you've heard the idea of the Big Bang, that the universe had a beginning. Actually, it's almost the opposite. It's real interesting. 100 years ago, scientists just assumed the universe had always existed. They didn't think there was a beginning to it. They thought matter and space had always been around. Scientists now believe the universe is actually about 13.7 billion years old and that it began with something that's been commonly known as the Big Bang. It's this astounding, amazing notion of a point of singularity and then everything came out of that. I mean, it's wild stuff when you read about it. For scientists to come to grips over the last century with the notion that there was a beginning was quite astounding. Francis Collins was the head of the Human Genome Project. He's now the head of the National Institute of Health. By the way, he was an atheist. He is now a devoted follower of Jesus Christ. And a major turning point in his conversion was reading the book Mere Christianity. He writes about this in another wonderful book about science and faith called The Language of God. Here's what Francis Collins wrote. The existence of the Big Bang begs the question of what came before that and who or what was responsible. It certainly demonstrates the limits of science as no other phenomenon has done. The science of awe the sense of awe created by these realizations has caused more than a few agnostic scientists to sound downright theological. In God and the Astronomers, an astrophysicist, Robert Gastrow, wrote this final paragraph. At this moment, it seems as though science will never be able to raise the curtain on the mystery of creation. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. He pulls himself over the final rock. He is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. And that little phrase, in the beginning, starts to look a whole lot different than it did a century or two ago. There's something even more staggering than just the existence of the Big Bang itself. There is this fact that the universe appears in the strangest way to have been designed to support life. This is something called the anthropic principle. It's talked about a lot by scholars in cosmology and physics. Anthropos is the Greek word for man. The universe seems strangely fine-tuned for life in a bunch of ways. And I'll just tell you one. And I'm going to do my best to describe this, but I've had a really hard time with this, so I'm just going to need you to stay with me for the next 2 minutes here. About 1 millisecond after the Big Bang, the universe cooled down enough for what are called quarks and antiquarks to condense out. And the way that worked, as I understand it, is any quark encountering an antiquark would result in the complete annihilation of both of them and the release of a little photon of energy. And that's all that was left, just annihilation. But as it turns out, there's not an equal number of quarks and antiquarks. As it turns out, the symmetry that you'd probably expect between quarks and antiquarks was off by the tiniest bit that no one could have ever predicted. It turns out that for every 1 billion antiquarks, there is one leftover lonely little quark. Now, why there is this asymmetry, no one knows, but it turns out if there had been an equal number of quarks and antiquarks, they would have annihilated each other and there would have been no existence of the universe. It turns out that 1 in a billion lonely leftover little quarks made it possible for there to be galaxies and stars and planets, and oh, by the way, you. Turn to the person next to you and say, you're a 1 in a billion. I mean, that's actually true. It's not just this. There turns out to be 15 different constants. So, like the precise force of gravity, such that it was altered enough that you'd weigh 1/100 of a pound less, or one way or more, one way or the other, the universe and your life could not exist. It's exactly what it needed to be. There are 15 different constants whose values would have to be exactly what they are for the universe to support life. And oh, by the way, that turns out to be exactly the way it is. And this is so striking that Stephen Hawking, who is not a person of faith, a physicist, a lot of you probably know, he writes this: it would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun the way it did, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us. That's a remarkable statement. Now, Stephen Hawking doesn't believe in a God like that. He believes that what you end up having to believe in, if you don't believe in a God, because our universe is so improbable, is what's called the multiverse. And some of you have heard about that. There are thousands, like millions of other kinds of universes we're not able to detect. And so it turns out, as a random throw of the dice, there ends up being this one universe that we live in that is actually livable. Now, to put it mildly, the notion that there are multiple universes has not been proven. Another Nobel-winning scientist who co-discovered the cosmic radiation that helped support the notion of the Big Bang in the first place, he wrote, "The best data we have from science are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, and the Bible as a whole." So has science proven that faith is irrational and God doesn't exist? Well, you need to think about that and decide on your own. And you can do a lot more reading about that. Is God against science? No. Has science proven that faith is irrational and God doesn't exist? I would say no, not by a long shot. And just personally, thinking and reading and researching about this gives me such a sense of wonder and awe about a God who would do all this. I have 2 more personal words. There are scientists in our church. Do you know what I've heard them say? Christian scientists in our church have said, when I'm at work and I'm with a bunch of scientists, they're real skeptical about my faith. They're suspicious about me. And then they say, when I go to church, they're skeptical about me because of my science. I feel like I don't have a place where I belong. And I just want to say today, all of you who do science, all of you who teach or research or are involved in engineering or medicine or education or biology or chemistry or physics or neuroscience, you are doing a noble thing. You're reading the book of creation while we're reading the book of the Bible. And some of you are reading both. You're obeying God's command given way back in Genesis to exercise dominion, to learn about, to be curious about, and discover and steward the earth. Those of us who are not scientists just shake our heads. I mean, we're grateful and admiring and humbled, and we just cheer you on. And we're so glad that you're a part of this church. And you're scientists, and you're thinkers and not feelers, and so you don't care that we cheer you on, but we cheer you on anyway. We're so glad and grateful and proud to be a part of a community with you. So keep learning, and keep teaching us, and be patient with us. I have one other thing to say, and then we'll be done. For everyone, whether you consider yourself a person of faith around this issue or not, let's just be a group of people who are humbly submitted to the truth. You must understand this about Jesus if you don't understand anything else about Jesus. Jesus is the kind of person who would be the first to tell you, you must ruthlessly follow truth wherever it leads you. And I say this because so often in our day, there's this misguided notion that some people, secularists or scientists, are open to truth, and that faith is about being a community where you can't listen to reason, or you have to believe whatever is written down in a book somewhere because it got written down in a book somewhere. It's simply not true. The Bible did not come into existence that way. It was part of a great, thoughtful conversation that went on for a long time by real thoughtful people. Jesus is the first person who would tell you, you must follow the truth ruthlessly wherever it leads you. Here's the last quote from C.S. Lewis. God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than any other slackers. I love that. God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than any other slackers. If you are thinking of becoming a Christian, I warn you, you are embarking on something which is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. And we want to have the whole of us, brains of all, on this journey. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes just for a moment? I want you to hear what the Apostle Paul wrote about Jesus 2,000 years ago. And I'd like to ask you just to sit in awe for a moment. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. All things were created by him and for him. God, would you help every one of us just to be open and humble before the truth? God, we are in awe. We are humbled by this reality that we find ourselves, that we are living on this planet that you've created. We thank you that Jesus made it. And God, when we think that Jesus cares about our little lives, that he notices us, that he actually became one of us, he died on a cross to give us hope, which just makes us so grateful. And so we give you our worship, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.